Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial. Today, we've got another video for you in our series on comparing the Iowa-class battleships to other contemporary ships. And today, we're going to be looking at the Colorado-class battleships. Before we get into that, we use the Iowa-class as our basis for comparison because I happen to have an Iowa-class battleship to show off. I know them pretty well. And you have the opportunity to go to one of 4 cities in the United States and visit an Iowa-class battleship and see how they look. So more people have visited Iowa-class battleships than possibly any other type of battleship. So I think that makes the best comparison. So when I say X ship is smaller or Y ship is smaller, you know what the size of an Io is. You've seen it. So the Colorado-class battleships are one of my favorite classes, although we don't talk about them much here on the channel. We are talking about it today because a viewer requested it and gave the channel a donation. They have a family member who served on board, and I don't like shouting out the names of viewers just for their privacy reasons. But so this video is dedicated to their family member, and they know who they are. So the Colorado-class battleships are also known as the Maryland class, depending on whether you're using a European or an American source. American sources would say that the first ship authorized is the lead ship of the class, and our battleships are in numerical order. So BB-45, Colorado, is the first one authorized and the first one named. So it's the Colorado class. In Europe, and Great Britain in particular, the first one completed would be the lead ship of the class. And that happens to be BB-46, Maryland. Maryland happens to be my home state, so I've always loved this class of ships, and Maryland in particular. The Colorado class were the last class of battleships the United States completed prior to the international treaty system that started with the Washington Naval Treaty. And that basically stops battleship construction for almost 2 decades, with a very few exceptions. And so between 1921, when these ships are commissioned, and 1941, when the North Carolina-class battleships are commissioned, these ships are the most powerful in the U.S. Navy. In a number of ways, they leave things to be desirable when compared to other contemporary ships of the treaty era, but they fall right in line with the American strategies at this time. They were standard type battleships. In fact, they're the last standard type battleships completed, and arguably the last type designed, because the later classes, the South Dakota and Lexington class capital ships, although they sort of have some standard features, are significantly heavier and have different speeds, and so they're not in fact standard. So the last standard type battleships. The standard type battleships were a series of classes that begins with Nevada and ends with the Colorados, where all of these ships basically have the same superstructure, the same secondary gun, pretty similar primary guns, similar armor protection. They all use the same all or nothing scheme, although the armor protection varies. Most of them use 14-inch guns, although these jump up to 16-inch. And otherwise, they're generally the same speed and turning radius, so they operate really well in a big battle line, which is what battleships were designed to operate in at the time. While other countries had capital ships with speeds all over the place and different superstructures and different turret configurations and whatnot, all of the standard type battleships are pretty freaking similar. And the United States saw that as an asset. Some people would look at them and say that, hey, they're way too conventional and you don't see any significant design improvements. And other people would look at them and say, hey, none of them obsolete the classes that came before them. And you do see improvements year over year, and it's constant progress. So the Colorado's basic design is equivalent to the preceding class, the Tennessee class. You see, the United States had been looking to increase to a 16-inch gun for years, since before World War I even started. Basically, they developed the 14-inch gun and then immediately started looking at a 16-inch gun. Secretary of the Navy Josephus Daniels didn't want the increase because it would also mean a roughly 8,000-ton increase in the size of ships, which is roughly 30% of ships at that time, just to improve the armor and add the guns and whatnot. And, our ships at the time are armed with 12 14-inch guns. We could arm them with 8 16-inch guns, and each individual shell would do more damage. But can you hit an enemy ship with 8 shells? It's sure easier to hit an enemy ship when you're firing 12 shells. So who cares if the shell will do more damage if it hits? It might not even hit. So the U.S. was resistant to this change for a while, and then Great Britain, Italy, Germany, and Japan all started to design ships with either 15 or 16-inch guns. And so the United States, which already had a design on the books, said, hey, let's just take the Tennessee-class battleship, which is a pretty decent design, remove the 14-inch turrets and that are triple, and drop in some twin 16-inch turrets that basically fits 1-to-1, and boom, we've got a 16-inch battleship design that we can roll out today. And because there isn't a significant size increase between the Tennessees and the Colorados, the Secretary of the Navy was like, okay, let's go with this. In fact, with World War I going on, let's build 4 of these instead of 2, which tended to be the standard. Every year the U.S. would build 2 ships in a class. So, hey, let's take 4 of these, then let's build 6 of the next class that's even bigger, and let's really take naval supremacy away from Great Britain. So, these ships begin being laid down in 1917. They're authorized a little bit earlier than that. The first ones are launched and or commissioned by 1921. Maryland is commissioned in 1921. The Washington Naval Treaty takes place in 1921, 1922. It's actually signed and ratified. So that says that certain numbers of ships have to be destroyed. Fortunately, Maryland and Colorado were far enough along that they were saved. The Japanese had just built a new battleship, Nagato, and they rushed her sister ship, Mutsu, through construction to get her completed before the treaty was ratified. And so the United States said, hey, we're supposed to have like 2/3 fighting power over the Japanese. They just gained parity with us with 16-inch armed battleships. We need to finish one of our other 2 ships in the class. And Great Britain said, okay, you can do that, but we have 0 16-inch armed battleships. You let us build 2 brand new ones, and we'll let you finish one of yours. So everybody shakes hands and agrees, and it is determined that the battleship West Virginia, battleship number 48, which is a little bit further along in construction and or the yard building it had more political clout, was chosen to be completed. And battleship number 47, Washington, was chosen to be scrapped. And in fact, not scrapped. It was chosen to be expended in bomb tests to see, hey, just how well does our armor do? So they hit it with a couple torpedoes, they hit it with a couple of bombs, and then finally they brought in the battleships New York and Texas to sink the hull with 14-inch guns. And they determined that, hey, the deck armor really isn't working out for us, and these ships should have a triple bottom, or future battleships should have a triple bottom. And these are changes that we see incorporated in American fast battleships right on up to New Jersey. So tests conducted on the incomplete hull of Washington, the last of our standard battleships, really informs what the next type of battleship will look like. And that's a pretty significant contribution. Other ships that the United States were sinking were at a similar time period were the German battleship Ostfriesland, which uses a very different armor scheme, and older pre-dreadnought type battleships, such as the original USS New Jersey BB-16, utterly antiquated by the time she was sunk. And so that does provide some data on what air attacks can do against battleships, but it doesn't really test the modern armor scheme the way sinking Washington did. Some people think that her loss was a huge waste of national resources. She was over 75% complete. But I believe that it was worthwhile. The treaty system worked for a time, and the information gleaned from that was important. So let's look at the design of these vessels. They were designed to be about 32,500 tons standard, and about 33,500 tons fully loaded. They were designed to be 624 feet long overall and 600 feet at the waterline. Battleship New Jersey is about 57,500 tons fully loaded, about 45,000 tons normal, 887 foot overall, and 860 feet at the waterline. So New Jersey is roughly 50% again as long as one of the Colorados. So if you were to line up all three completed Colorados and two of the Iowas, they would be roughly equivalent in length and width. So that shows you a little bit how much battleships grow in the 20 years that we aren't even building battleships. The crew complement was about 1,300 as originally built. Wartime that goes up. These ships were designed with turbo-electric drive. They had 8 Babcocks and Wilcox boilers, like New Jersey, that were feeding 4 propellers, but it wasn't steam turbines like the Iowas have. Turbo-electric drive, you were using your boilers to create steam to turn turbo generators, which Battleship New Jersey does have for creating electrical power. But instead of also having turbines that are attached to a gear reduction box attached to the propeller shaft to produce propulsive power, you're using your turbo generators to send electrical power to an electric motor. And that electric motor then turns your propeller shaft. And there are a number of reasons why turbo-electric drive is superior to traditional steam turbines. For one, you can run the turbines, the turbo generators, at whatever speed you want, whatever's most efficient, and you're just powering the motor to whatever speed you want. So you can more rapidly shift speeds. There's a lot less gearing, and there's a lot less steam piping involved here. And you can rapidly switch from a head to a stern by simply reversing the electric motors. And perhaps most importantly for a battleship, you can really subdivide the ship better. So the Colorados have their traditional torpedo defense system, very similar to the Iowa class, a couple feet narrower because torpedoes were less powerful back then, so it wasn't designed as thick. Then you have your boiler rooms on the outside, and each boiler is in a separate armored compartment, and they form a separate part of your torpedo defense. And then you have your engine rooms, or really in this case motor rooms, inside of that, pretty well protected. And as boilers go down, you can just reroute where the electrical power is going. It's way easier to route electrical cable than it is to route steam lines or propeller shafting. However, this system is heavier, and there's some concerns that it is less resilient to damage. I don't particularly subscribe to that. I'm a pretty big fan of turbo-electric drive. However, with the Washington Naval Treaty limiting the displacement of ships, it basically does not come back for battleships in the U.S. Navy. They stick with the lighter steam turbines to meet their treaty limitations. The Colorados are only 97 feet wide as built, although they will be bulged out wider than that later in their careers. So they're not significantly, they're about 11 feet narrower than the Iowas. They can more easily fit through the Panama Canal as built. They were designed to only draw about 30 feet, although that would increase. These ships undergo a number of changes in their careers, and we'll go into that in a minute. They were designed with a belt that was 13.5 inches wide. That's pretty good for 14-inch shells. They're retaining the same belt as the Tennessees, but it's less effective against the 16-inch guns that they were armed with. It tapers down to 8 inches below the waterline. The turret barbets are 13 inches thick. The turret faceplates are 18 inches thick. The conning tower's only about 11.5 inches thick as designed. And some of the ships have this deleted eventually. The main deck ends up being about 3.5 inches thick. And then a separate splinter deck under that is about 2.25 inches thick at the maximum. So this was one of those places where they looked at on Washington, hey, having the main deck be the main armored deck doesn't really work. We should replace that and have the thinner deck above and the thicker one below. And that's what we end up getting with the Iowa-class battleships. So these ships are originally built with 8 16-inch 45 caliber guns. They're originally designed with 14 5-inch guns, although pretty early on this number is dropped to 12 and later 10. And in some of the ships, the 5-inch 51s are deleted entirely. This is a gun that is purely anti-surface. And it's got a good high caliber, so it's got a good flat trajectory. You can aim it pretty well by eye without needing rangefinders. So it's a really good gun in its day. But by World War II, it's kind of obsolete. They had 2 21-inch torpedo tubes like standard type battleships did. They were originally outfitted with 4 3-inch guns, although pretty early on they had that doubled to 8, and they had they'd lose 2 of their 5-inch guns, and eventually the 8 3-inch guns are replaced with 5 5-inch 25 caliber guns, which is an anti-aircraft weapon. Eventually they receive 3-inch guns again, 4 of them as a medium-range anti-aircraft gun. The gunnery changes on these ships are ridiculous, and it's not standard throughout the class. So shortly after being built, they removed some 5-inch guns, they put in 3-inch guns. Not too long after that, they replaced the 3-inch guns with 5-inch guns. As World War II approaches, they realize that the anti-aircraft battery is deficient. So in addition to the 5-inch guns as their long-range defense, like other standard battleships, they get 4 medium defensive gun positions and about 11 50 caliber guns. 4 medium guns are supposed to be the 1.1-inch Chicago piano type. These are not made in high enough quantities, so they end up actually getting the 3-inch guns installed. And then as the 1.1-inch guns become available, the 3-inch guns are swapped out. So by the attack on Pearl Harbor, Maryland had 1.1-inch guns. West Virginia still had 3-inch guns. Over the course of the war, the changes, it's basically monthly. They're adding new 1.1-inch guns and new 20-millimeter guns and deleting 50 cals and then 1.1s and adding 40 millimeters and blah, 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 blah. Eventually, they have 10 quadruple mounts for 40-millimeter guns, so only half as much as the Iowa-class battleships. There just isn't as much deck area to retrofit these guns. And they have typically about 32 20-millimeter guns scattered throughout the ship. West Virginia would have 50 at one point. But again, these numbers vary throughout time. These 3 ships, along with the 2 Tennessees, are known as the Big Five. They are the most powerful warships in the U.S. Navy during the interwar years. Because they're the most powerful, they do not receive as many upgrades and modernizations as the older battleships do. There are a number of occasions when upgrades are planned. So things keep being added, like all those new 5-inch guns and whatnot, and it keeps making the ship sit lower and lower in the water. So first of all, they want to use a clause in the Washington Naval Treaty to add torpedo blisters and extra deck armor to these ships. And the blisters add more void spaces, which is going to allow the ships to float higher in the water, which means that their armored belt isn't going to be submerged. And it gives them a greater reserve of buoyancy. Some of these changes start to get implemented piecemeal in 1941, and other changes they just never had time for or money for because of the Great Depression. Still others, because of changing wartime priorities, never actually get implemented. Colorado is in dry dock at Puget Sound getting her blisters added during the attack on Pearl Harbor, so she's the only Pacific Fleet battleship not caught in Pearl Harbor. Maryland had just had her blisters added and was at Pearl Harbor, moored inboard of Oklahoma. She took 2 bomb hits that both proved to be duds and got away the least damaged of any of the Pearl Harbor ships. Weavy, on the other hand, was the most damaged of the big 5 battleships. She took somewhere around 7 torpedo hits and 5 bomb hits because she was moored outboard of Tennessee. So she sank, and fortunately her crew counterflooded, so she sank on an even keel, and that would allow her to be raised later in the war, but because of the level of damage, she was a lower priority compared to other ships that could be put back in the fight pretty quickly. Because she was so badly damaged, West Virginia basically doesn't enter the war until the invasion of the Philippines in 1944, in late 1944, when the Iowa-class battleships are already there. Her modernization looks very similar to the preceding Tennessee-class, and it's real impressive. She gets big bulges added. It prevents her from going through the Panama Canal, but it adds a tremendous reserve of buoyancy. She gets modern radars and fire controls and anti-aircraft batteries. And most interestingly, a modern superstructure that looks pretty similar to the Iowas or the South Dakotas, really to the South Dakotas with the single trunked funnel. She gets modern 5-inch 38 caliber anti-aircraft guns, and in general comes out of that a brand new ship, perfectly optimized for shore bombardment. At this point, she's more of a sister ship to Tennessee and California than she is to Maryland and Colorado. She participates in the Battle of Suragawa Strait, and with her radar fire control, the most modern of any of the shore bombardment ships there, she is able to score hits on a Japanese battleship with her first salvo. Her misses with her 16-inch guns explode so high that Maryland, which doesn't have a good surface search set, but does have air search radar, is able to pick up the 16-inch shell hits on her air search set so she can fire a couple of rounds. So that's pretty impressive. I really like the look of West Virginia as she comes out. She doesn't really do too much in the war, and besides lighting off Okinawa and Iwo Jima. And like the other 2 ships in the class, she's decommissioned in 1947 and finally scrapped about a decade later. Meanwhile, Colorado and Maryland form the core of Task Force 1, which is the reconstituted battle line in the days after Pearl Harbor. These ships are maintained pretty much on the West Coast, where there's enough fuel oil for them, and so they can protect the American homeland instead of being forward deployed in Pearl Harbor where they could be hit. Because of the low speed of these ships and their importance to national defense and their high fuel consumption, they don't really see much action early in the war. They do a tremendous number of training cruises and pretty quickly exceed the capacity of the battle line that was lost at Pearl Harbor. However, they're not thrown in at Midway. They're held in reserve. They're not thrown in during those dark days at the beginning part of the war. They're not thrown into the Solomon Islands campaign. And it's not really until the Central Pacific campaign that these ships are committed for shore bombardment. And so Maryland and Colorado serve their way through, and because they are so constantly on standby, neither ship receives much modernization. Both have their mainmast, the after cage tower, cut down and basically replaced with a tower. This frees up the arcs of fire of the anti-aircraft guns. And for those of you who don't know, the triple-tiered fire control towers that show up either on tripods on ships like Arizona's or cage masts on ships like Maryland and Colorado Those are the fire control directors for the main guns. The lower level is the 5-inch director, and the upper two level are for the 14 or 16-inch guns, depending on the class. Really, you have two for redundancy, and so that one can look at the target and the other can look at the horizon to take into account the rocking of the ship. The invention of the gyroscopically stabilized stable vertical that forms the trigger console for modern battleships such as New Jersey. You no longer need that after tower. And the guns have their own rangefinder, so you don't need the redundancy of another rangefinder. So you can chop that down and improve the arcs of fire for your AA guns. And that's what they end up doing. Otherwise, these ships have to receive damage in order to get any sort of major upgrades. And so by the end of the war, Maryland is in the closest configuration to Pearl Harbor of any of the Pearl Harbor battleships. Everyone else has been pretty heavily modernized besides her. She only got dual-purpose 5-inch 38s in gun mounts because she was damaged. I don't even believe poor Colorado got that. I think she still had a mix of 5-inch 51s for surface ships, and her 5-inch 25s had been replaced by 5-inch 38 pedestal mounts, open mounts, but she never received the 5-inch twin turrets that the Iowa class or other American battleships of the time had. So, how do these ships compare to the Iowa? Well, they're significantly slower. In fact, the Iowas were built with the concept of a 21-knot battle line in mind to be the fast wing of the battle line. So speed-wise, they're out. Armor-wise, their individual armor plates are thicker than the Iowas in most places. However, the Iowas have a more novel system of layering that armor. They have an internal belt instead of an external belt, which I believe makes their armor more effective, as it should be. There's 20 years of design and development difference between these two classes of ships. In terms of firepower, for the main battery, you aren't actually losing much. The Colorados have 8 16-inch guns to the 9 that the Iowas have. And more importantly, they're in 4 twin turrets. So if each ship suffers a hit to a turret, they have equivalent firepower at that point. They're down to 6 16-inch guns. So some people consider the balanced arrangement of 2 turrets forward, 2 turrets aft to be superior to the arrangement that the United States went with the Iowa class. And I believe, had there not been a treaty system, the United States would have remained with that balanced system with similar number of guns fore and aft. And it's only because of the weight-saving issues brought on by the treaty that they use the 9-gun triple turreted system. The Iowas do have 16-inch 50 caliber guns to 16-inch 45, so the Iowas have better range. In terms of fire control, the Iowas blow the Colorados out of the water in World War II, with the exception of West Virginia, which basically has a comparable fire control system. She's utterly modernized. In fact, I would argue that West Virginia, with her deeper torpedo bulges that prevent her from going through the Panama Canal, has a better torpedo defense than the Iowas. I believe it's a deeper torpedo defense too. Anti-aircraft batteries, the Iowas are still longer ships, and they have about 20% more guns. So they have the better AA defense. By the end of the war, they all have pretty comparable air search radars and directors, so that's kind of a wash. Crew size, it's a significantly smaller investment in crew and overall material for the Colorado class. So it's just cheaper to have a bunch of them than it is to have a couple of Iowas. So that's a good thing. In terms of service life, did the U.S. get more service out of one class or the other? Actually, the service lives of these classes was pretty similar. The Colorados served for basically from the 1920s through the 1940s. So about 20 some odd years, and a major world war in the middle of that. The Iowa served through a world war, and depending on the ship, between 12 and 22 years of active service. So despite the Iowas being in mothballs and being around for 50 years, New Jersey only had 22 years of service. Wisconsin only had 12 years of service. So arguably, the United States got more service life out of the Colorados, and the Colorados served as a more potent deterrent in that the United States didn't get into any wars, or with the exception of World War II, so only got into one war while having those as the most powerful ships. The Iowas were brought back to service many times whenever there was a war fought. So by placing them in mothballs, the United States was able to get a lot of service out of the Iowas, bringing them back out as needed. When the Colorados went into mothballs, they basically just ate up resources for 10 years and then were scrapped. So that wasn't particularly efficient. But at least West Virginia, with all of her modernizations, being a virtually new ship at that point, had service life left to give. I'd say Colorado and Maryland were pretty well worn out by the end of the war, and would have needed a major overhaul similar to what West Virginia got. But West Virginia would have made a more effective shore bombardment ship during the Korean War than the Iowas. She's slower, sure, but you didn't need the Iowa speed at all. She's a much cheaper ship to be able to put out there, and otherwise she's as effective. And if, God forbid, something happened to her, the United States can always say, oh, that ship is 25 years old, obsolete battleship, hit by mine or hit by MiG or whatever the case may be. Whereas had something happened to the Iowas during this time period, it would have been a state-of-the-art, frontline, completely modern unit being damaged. All in all, I'm pretty biased towards the Colorado-class battleships, being my state's namesake ship. But because they're 20 years older, they have a lot of deficiencies compared to New Jersey. It's not really a fair comparison. If you compare them to other contemporary ships, they come out very favorable when you look at most British ships. The older R-class and Queen Elizabeth-class battleships only have 15-inch guns, so the Colorados have similar armor, a little bit lower speed in some cases, but heavier firepower. The Nelsons even come out pretty equivalent, even though they're a generation ahead of them. The only British ship that really, I'd say, exceeds the Colorados would be HMS Hood. She's, of course, a one-off, and she has almost 10,000 tons on the Colorados. More importantly, looking at the Japanese, I would say that the Nagatos are a more effective battleship. They have higher speed, equivalent firepower, and almost comparable armor. I'd say the Colorados have better armor, but the Nagatos, I think, are an all-around more balanced ship. But at the end of the day, you've only got 2 Nagatos and you've got 3 Colorados. So it's all a wash in the end. So, what do you guys think about the Colorado-class battleships and the American standard-type battleship in general? Let us know in the comment section down below. Also, let us know what ship you'd like to see us compare it to next. We've had a couple of suggestions out there. Right now, I'm leaning towards the Queen Elizabeth-class battleships. They are a favorite of mine, and I think as the basically grandfather of the fast battleship concept, they are worth looking at in the context of the Iowa-class battleships. But if you guys have another ship idea in mind that you would like to see us cover in a couple of weeks, feel free to let us know. And I will give priority if you make a donation to the channel and say that, hey, I'd like to see this, much like with the Colorado-class battleships. And I'm not asking for $1,000 here, but hey, you throw a little bit our way, and I'll absolutely bump the ship you want up in the tier. Speaking of money, Battleship New Jersey receives operating support from the New Jersey Department of State. We also have business sponsors, but our YouTube channel primarily has individual sponsors, like viewers like you. So your support is hugely important to us. We really appreciate it, and it's allowed us to go from making one video a week to making this a larger part of our job so we can shoot as many as 5 videos a week. There is a link in the description to donate. We really appreciate your support there. Also remember to like, share, and subscribe. It helps the channel grow, helps more people see us, and it'll notify you that we're putting out more videos. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.